There has been another terrorist bombing attack against Iran. An Iranian academic and some innocent bystanders were blown up with a magnetically placed car bomb on the streets of Tehran. One thing is sure, it was Israel, our Zionist-financed and controlled American puppets behind the terrorism. I wouldn't even put it past Israel to plant evidence trying to make the Iranians think it was America trying to elicit an Iranian military response. But make no mistake, it was terrorism. Imagine if Iran had bombed an American scientist on American streets. Imagine if an Israeli scientist was bombed on a street in Tel Aviv. You'd hear no end of the evil terrorist state of Iran. But how did our Zionist-influenced globalist media report this terrorist attack? The most influential newspaper in the world is the New York Times. It's owned by Zionists, run by Zionists. How did the New York Times report the attack? Here's the actual headline. Iran reports killing of nuclear scientist in, quote, terrorist blast. Note how they manipulate us even in the headlines. The word terrorist is in quotation marks. Would the media put terrorist in quotation marks if Iran had blown up some Americans on our streets? Here's the Washington Post story. Not one time did the Post use the term terrorist or terrorism to describe the bombing and murder. It's almost certain that the Israeli Mossad was behind this bloody terrorist attack. You see, Iran doesn't commit terrorist attacks, but Israel does. Israel blows up and assassinates its enemies all over the world. Iran has not stolen anybody else's land and homes and farms, or ethnically cleansed hundreds of thousands of people, tortured hundreds of thousands of people in Palestine and Lebanon, or invaded other people's nations like Israel did in Lebanon, and killed tens of thousands of Christians and Muslims. The Iranian Air Force doesn't drop white phosphorus on apartment buildings and homes and burn and kill and maim thousands of women and children in their beds as they slept, as they did in Gaza, where half of the murdered, half of 1,200 civilians were women and children. And Israel's even committed terrorist attacks against America, its biggest benefactor. In the 1950s, Israeli Mossad agents actually blew up American libraries, movie theaters, and shops trying to blame Egypt and get America into a war with Egypt. Not 1 in 100 Americans even know about this Israeli terrorism, but it's fact. The Zionist agents were caught red-handed, and the Israeli military chief, Penis Lavon, had to resign because the mission failed. If Iran had ever launched terrorist attacks on America, it would be repeated every day as proof of Iran's evil and the need for war. Israel's Levant terrorism would have caused the death of innocent Egyptians and thousands of Americans. But you probably don't even know about it. Ask yourself, why have you never heard of the Levant affair? Unless, of course, you've already heard about it from me. In 1967, Israel with unmarked planes attacked the clearly marked and flagged USS Liberty intelligence ship in international waters off Israel. They tried to sink the ship and kill every American. They even machine-gunned the life rafts. Again, they wanted to blame Egypt and get us into another catastrophic war. America's Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, said it was clear that this was a deliberate, purposeful act against the United States by Israel, a terrorist surprise attack that killed 34 Americans and maimed and burned 174. How could any truly patriotic and loyal American support Israel after such a vicious attack? And you probably don't even know about the Israeli fingerprints that are all over the 9/11 attacks. Now forget for a moment about the other suspicious aspects of the attack, and there are plenty of them. Just consider the indisputable fact that Israeli Mossad agents had tapped the phones and shadowed the alleged hijackers for months before 9/11. The Israeli team even lived on the same street as alleged hijack leader Mohammed Atta. Here's a clip from Britt Hume.
Now Fox News has learned some U.S. investigators believe that there are Israelis again very much engaged in spying in and on the U.S., who may have known things they didn't tell us before September 11th.
Since September 11th, more than 60 Israelis have been arrested or detained, either under the new Patriot anti-terrorism law or for immigration violations. A handful of active Israeli military were among those detained, according to investigators, who say some of the detainees also failed polygraph questions when asked about alleged surveillance activities against and in the United States. Investigators suspect that the Israelis may have gathered intelligence about the attacks in advance and not shared it. A highly placed investigator said there are, quote, tie-ins. Evidence linking these Israelis to 911 is classified. I cannot tell you about evidence that has been gathered. It's classified information. Numerous classified documents obtained by Fox News indicate that even prior to September 11th, as many as 140 other Israelis had been detained or arrested in a secretive and sprawling investigation into suspected espionage by Israelis in the United States. Documents say they, quote, targeted and penetrated military bases, the DEA, FBI, and dozens of other government facilities, and even secret offices and unlisted private homes of law enforcement and intelligence personnel. The majority of those questioned, quote, stated they served in military intelligence, electronic surveillance intercept, and or explosive ordnance units.
What about this question of advanced knowledge of what was going to happen on 9/11? How clear are investigators that some Israeli agents may have known something?
Well, it's very explosive information, obviously, and there's a great deal of evidence that they say they have collected. A bigger question, they say, is how could they not have known? Almost a direct quote, Brett.
The evidence is that at the very least, Israel knew about the planned attacks and then diabolically didn't warn America. And of course, the attacks ultimately led America to use its money and the blood of its young men to fulfill the Zionist agenda against its biggest enemy at the time, Iraq. Many Americans cannot comprehend how Israel would do such an evil thing as purposefully letting thousands of innocent Americans die for Israel's agenda. But the record is clear. And now, just as in the days before the Iraq War, the Zionists are once again driving us to war again. Sometimes a bit of truth, though, ekes out in the mainstream media. And here's a clip from Chris Matthews with an intelligence official who reveals that Israel is committing terrorist acts to manipulate America into war against Iran.
Welcome back to Horrible. There's an amazing spy story taking place in Iran. Yesterday, an Iranian nuclear scientist was assassinated in a rush-hour attack in the streets of Tehran. It is likely part of a wider covert war going on against the Iranian nuclear program. Look what's happened just in the past few years. At least 5 scientists have been targeted in similar attacks. One of the scientists survived. The others were killed. A number of mysterious explosions have been reported at sites thought to be military complexes. One of the attacks killed a top missile expert. No country has taken responsibility for any of these attacks on the Iranian nuclear program, but Iran has accused the United States and Israel. So what's going on here? Robert Baer is a former CIA officer in the Middle East. He's now an intelligence columnist for Time magazine. Generally, what's going on? Will these attacks have a pattern? Does it have the fingerprints of Mossad, the Israeli agency?
Oh, it's undoubtedly the Israelis. It couldn't be anybody else. You just look at the target. The Israelis, as far as I can see, are trying to provoke the Iranians into doing something. It's almost as if the intention is to get the Iranians to fire a missile at an oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz, which would cause a wider war. It would force the United States.
Why would that help us?
It wouldn't help us. It would help them because the Israelis would force us into hitting the Iranians, hitting back, and that's exactly what they want.
Oh, you think it's Israel trying to get us into this thing? Let's go right now to NBC's chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel. Richard, you had a report on the nightly news last night. Give us the gist of it. Where are we at on this thing?
If you want to hit Iran and you need a context to do that, you need a pretext to do it, the way to do that is by forcing Iran into a corner, forcing your adversary to make some sort of aggressive move, and then everyone will think you are correct when you respond with force.
How can the United States not see this as adversarial by Israel to try to hook us into a war, Richard? If that's the case, if Bob Baer is right in saying this is an attempt, a three-way move to try to get us in by getting the Iranians mad at us, by the actions they take in terms of these assassinations, if that's seen to manipulate us into a war we don't want to get into, how can we not see that as relatively, well, from an ally, certainly a hostile?
Chris Matthews is obviously shocked by all this, but he does not dare condemn Israel for trying to create a war which would cost the lives of thousands of Americans and Iranians and trillions of dollars cost to America and to the world. Of course, Iran's nuclear program for electricity is perfectly legal. Iran has signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It has allowed complete inspections. Who's the real nuclear rogue state? Israel has not signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It has not allowed inspections. It has huge stockpiles of biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons. And Israeli officials have even threatened to use its nuclear weapons. Even the top 17 intelligence agencies of America, the National Intelligence Estimate, declared last year that there's no evidence that Iran is trying to build nukes. An American commission, though, has found that Israel, in defiance of America, has a huge stockpile of nuclear weapons. Iran naturally wants to produce its own fuel to make its own electricity. It knows that if the Zionist-influenced powers can control the nuclear fuel for their reactors, that Iran can be blackmailed to do whatever the Zionists want. And that's the real reason for the push to war against Iran. It is simply because Iran, more than any other nation on earth, stands up to Zionist Israel and the Zionist globalist power and their crimes. It is the same reason why they drove us to war against Iraq, because Saddam dared to support the Palestinians. They called Saddam Hitler. And now they call Ahmadinejad Hitler. And the truth is that if Santa Claus wanted to help the Palestinians, they'd call him Hitler too. The truth is that Israel is the real terrorist state, and Israel gets away with all this evil. Why? Because the same supremacist tribe that runs Israel dominates the American and globalist media like the New York Times and Washington Post. Because they control the Federal Reserve, the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, and the biggest international predatory banks in the world, such as Goldman Sachs. And because they have bribed and infiltrated and unduly influenced scores of politicians and bureaucrats around the world. Even though Iran has suffered from repeated terrorist attacks from both the CIA and Israel over the years, it has been very restrained. Imagine if Iran made terrorist attacks in America, like the bombing in Tehran recently. America would have already bombed them in retaliation. Israel's terrorism against Tehran is not only an international crime against that country, it's a crime against America, as it's trying to provoke an Iranian response against America and a war that would be devastating to Iran and the world. Iran understands that Israel exists because of their control over American foreign policy. They understand the responsibility in regard to Israel of America. A war with Iran would be devastating to Iran, America, and the entire world. And these insane Zionist extremists, in their bloodlust, can't even see how it will also be devastating to their own Jewish people as well. The real rogue state, the real enemy of peace, it's not Iran, it's Israel. We need sanctions not against Iran, but against Israel. The Zionist fifth column has infiltrated our government, our media, and now controls the finances of the United States and Europe. And they want to control the finances of Iran too. The U.S., at the behest of its Zionist master, just launched sanctions to destroy Iran's central bank and impoverish millions of people in that nation. You see, Zionist globalism is the great danger to us all and to all humanity. The Zionists admit that the Iranian government uses the sale of its oil to help feed their people. So they've admitted they want to purposely starve millions of innocent people in support of Zionism. Zionism is just as much a danger to Americans and Britons and Frenchmen as it is to the people of Iran. But I believe you can recognize the truth when you finally hear it. If you and all of us spread this truth in this video, we can help avoid a horrific war that would cast the world into hell. I'm doing all I can, but it's really up to you. What will you do? If you have children, how can you look into their eyes without doing everything you can to help stop this insane Zionist war that will so harm them and their future? Together we can stop this crazy war before it begins. But we've got to do something now.